Hi, everybody. I'm Bernard Schwartz, the director of the 92nd Streetwise Unterberg Poetry Center, and I want to welcome you to tonight's celebration of Audre Lorde, occasioned by the new publication of selected works of Audre Lorde, edited by Roxane Gay. Uh, Tonight's event will be a series of readings followed by a conversation between Roxane and one of the readers, Saeed Jones. The way that we'll proceed is first with remarks and a reading by Roxane, followed by a reading by Mahogany L. Browne, followed by another reading by Porsha Olayiwola, and then Saeed will read before talking to Roxane. I would encourage all of you to submit questions via the website's chat function, and we'll be sure to get to some of those at the end of Roxane's conversation with Saeed. Thanks for joining us, and enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here this evening virtually. And I am really thrilled to be here because I have loved Audre Lorde since I was a very young woman, nearly 30 years. And to be able to put together a collection of her work has been one of the greatest honors of my career thus far. You know, as I was thinking about this book, I couldn't help but realize that a lot of what Audre was talking about in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s is still applicable now, which is a little depressing. But as I reread her work to decide what to include, I just was astonished by the power of her work and how she was able to do that thing that writers crave, which is to be both timely and timeless. And she particularly did a great job, I mean, superlatives apply only, in terms of talking about what it means to be a Black gay woman. You don't often see people writing from that subject position, especially 30 years ago. And for her to do so unapologetically was a beacon. And really, a lot of us who are writing today are doing so because of the work that she did. And so as I thought about what I wanted to read tonight, I wanted to read Poetry is Not a Luxury, which is an essay of hers that I always come back to, especially in times like this where people wonder what the value of creativity is and what the value of art is. And so this is Poetry is Not a Luxury. The quality of light by which we scrutinize our lives has direct bearing upon the product which we live and upon the changes which we hope to bring about through those lives. It is within this light that we form those ideas by which we pursue our magic and make it realized. This is poetry as illumination, for it is through poetry that we give name to those ideas which are, until the poem, nameless and formless, about to be birthed, but already felt. That distillation of experience from which true poetry springs, births thought as dreams births concept, as feeling births idea, as knowledge births precedes understanding. As we learn to bear the intimacy of scrutiny and to flourish within it, as we learn to use the products of that scrutiny for the power within our living, those fears which rule our lives and form our silences begin to lose their control over us. For each of us as women, there is a dark place within where hidden and growing our true spirit rises, beautiful and tough as chestnut, stanchions against your nightmare of weakness and of impotence. These places of possibility within ourselves are dark because they are ancient and hidden. They have survived and grown strong through that darkness. Within these deep places, each one of us holds an incredible reserve of creativity and power, of unexamined and unrecorded emotion and feeling. The woman's place of power within each of us is neither white nor surface. It is dark, it is ancient, and it is deep. When we view living in the European mode only as a problem to be solved, we rely solely upon our ideas to make us free, for these were what the white fathers told us were precious. But as we come more into touch with our own ancient, non European consciousness of living as a situation to be experienced and interacted with, we learn more and more to cherish our feelings and to respect those hidden sources of our power from where true knowledge and therefore lasting action comes. At this point in time, I believe that women carry within ourselves the possibility for fusion of these two approaches so necessary for survival. And we come closest to this combination in our poetry. I speak here of poetry as revelatory distillation of experience, not the sterile wordplay that too often the white fathers distorted the word poetry to mean, in order to cover a desperate wish for imagination without insight. For women, then, poetry is not a luxury, it is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams toward survival and change, first made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action. Poetry is the way we help give name to the nameless so it can be thought. The farthest horizons of our hopes and fears are cobbled by our poems, carved from the rock experiences of our daily lives. As they become known to and accepted by us, our feelings and the honest exploration of them become sanctuaries and spawning grounds for the most radical and daring of ideas. They become a safe house for that difference so necessary to change and the conceptualization of any meaningful action. Right now, I could list at least 10 ideas I would have found intolerable or incomprehensible and frightening, except as they came after dreams and poems. This is not idle fantasy, but a disciplined attention to the true meaning of "it feels right to me." We can train ourselves to respect our feelings and to transpose them into a language so they can be shared. And where that language does not yet exist, it is our poetry which helps to fashion it. Poetry is not only dream and vision, it is the skeleton architecture of our lives. It lays the foundations for a future of change, a bridge across our fears of what has never been before. Thank you.
Yes, yes, Miss Roxanne. My name is Mahogany L. Browne. I'm so excited to share space with Roxane Gay, Saeed Jones, and Porsha Olayiwola. And of course, to be here and celebrate the work of Audre Lorde. Not only was she a feminist lesbian warrior poet, but she's a pillar for so many of us. And something that I wrote in regards to what she means to me. Audre Lorde passed down to each of us the power of information. Each of us holds to our chest what solidifies our understanding of our place in this world. What can a body do with such an understanding? What kind of potential unearths with insurmountable possibilities are presented? How are we reinforced with the inheritance of this truth? Our communities bloom endlessly with this knowing. Audre Lorde's work is a contribution to the transformation of our very being. Our humanity requires it. And I'll share a small portion from the essay, Eye to Eye, Black Women, Hatred and Anger, and then I'll close with a small poem. I know the anger that lies inside of me, like I know the beat of my heart and the taste of my spit. It is easier to be angry than to be hurt. Anger is what I do best. It is easier to be furious than to be yearning, easier to crucify myself in you than to take on the threatening universe of whiteness by admitting that we are worth wanting each other. As Black women, we have shared so many similar experiences. Why doesn't this commonality bring us closer together instead of setting us at each other's throat with weapons well honed by familiarity? Who did we expect the other to be who is not yet at peace with our own selves? I cannot shut you out the way I shut the others out, so maybe I can destroy you. Must destroy you? We do not love ourselves, therefore we cannot love each other because we see in each other's face our own face, the face we never stopped wanting because we survived and survival breeds desire for more self. A face we never stopped wanting at the same time as we tried to obliterate it. Why don't we meet each other's eyes? Do we expect betrayal in each other's gaze or recognition? If just once we were to feel the pain of all Black women's blood flowing up to drown us, I stayed afloat, buoyed by an anger so deep at my loneliness that I could only move toward further survival. When one cannot influence a situation, it is an act of wisdom to withdraw. I Ching. Every Black woman in America has survived several lifetimes of hatred, where even in the candy store cases of our childhood, little brown nigga baby candies testified against us. We survived the wind-driven spittle on our child's shoe and pink flesh-colored Band-Aids, attempted rapes on rooftops, and the prodding fingers of the super's boy seeing our girlfriends blown to bits in Sunday school, and we absorbed that loathing as a natural state. We had to metabolize such hatred that our cells have learned to live upon it because we had to, or die of it. Old King Mithridates learned to eat arsenic bit by bit, and so, outwitted by his poisoners, but I'd have hated to kiss him upon his lips. Now, we deny such hatred ever existed because we have learned to neutralize it through ourselves. And the catabolic process throws off waste products of fury, even when we love. Black women, eating our own hearts out of nourishment in an empty house, empty compound, empty city, in an empty season, and for each of us, 1 year, the spring will not return. We learn to savor the taste of our own flesh before any other, because that was all that was allowed us. And we have become to each other unmentionably dear and immeasurably dangerous. I am writing about an anger so huge and implacable, so corrosive, it must destroy what it most needs for its own solution. Dissolution, resolution. Here, we are attempting to address each other's eyes directly, even if our words taste sharp as the edge of a lost woman's voice. We are speaking. And you can read the rest of that as you should. I'm telling you, it's testimony, okay? The piece I would like to close with before we hear from Porsha O is a litany for survival. And if you know it, wherever you are, sing along at home, honey. Make your neighbors feel upset about it because we are surviving, we are thriving. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways, coming and going, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward, at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak Yes, it is better to speak. I said, it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Mahogany Browne, Roxane Gay, Saeed Jones. I'm so honored to be reading with folks in lieu of the Lorde, of Audre Lorde. I'll be reading two pieces. The first is the prologue from Zami, a biomythography written by Lorde. And it is probably the reason I write queer intimacy, love, etc. poems. And it goes, I have always wanted to be both man and woman, to incorporate the strongest and richest parts of my mother and father within / into me, to share valleys and mountains upon my body the way the earth does in hills and peaks. I would like to enter a woman the way any man can, and to be entered, to leave and to be left, to be hot and hard and soft all at the same time in the cause of our loving. I would like to drive forward and at other times rest or be driven. When I sit and play in the waters of my bath, I love to feel the deep inside parts of me, sliding and folded and tender and deep. Other times I like to fantasize the core of it, my pearl, a protruding part of me, hard and sensitive and vulnerable in a different way. I have felt the age-old triangle of mother, father, and child with I at its eternal core, elongate and flatten out into an elegantly strong triad of grandmother, mother, daughter, with the I moving back and forth, flowing in either or both directions as desired. Woman forever. My body, a living representation of other life, older, longer, wiser. The mountains and valleys, trees, rocks, sand and flowers and water and stone made in earth. And again, that's from the prologue of Zami. It starts off that biomythography. This next piece is probably, other than Litany for Survival, which Browne just blessed us with, is Power by Audre Lorde. And I'm gonna get into that and then I'm gonna pass it on. Power. The difference between poetry and rhetoric is being ready to kill yourself instead of your children. I am trapped on a desert of raw gunshot wounds and a dead child dragging his shattered black face off the edge of my sleep. Blood from his punctured cheeks and shoulders is the only liquid for miles, and my stomach churns at the imagined taste while my mouth splits into dry lips without loyalty or reason, thirsting for the wetness of his blood as it sinks into the whiteness of the desert where I am lost without imagery or magic, trying to make power out of hatred and destruction. Trying to heal my dying son with kisses, only the sun will bleach his bones quicker. A policeman who shot down a 10-year-old in Queens stood over the boy with his cop shoes and childish blood, and a voice said, "Die, you little motherfucker," and there are tapes to prove it. At his trial, this policeman said in his own defense, "I didn't notice the size, nor nothing else, only the color." And there are tapes to prove that too. Today, that 37-year-old white man with 13 years of police forcing was set free by 11 white men who said they were satisfied justice had been done, and one black woman who said, "They convinced me." Meaning, They had dragged her 4'10" Black woman's frame over the hot coals of 4 centuries of white male approval until she let go, the first real power she ever had, and lined her own womb with cement to make a graveyard for our children. I have not been able to touch the destruction within me. But unless I learn to use the difference between poetry and rhetoric, my power too will run corrupt as poisonous mold or lie limp and useless as an unconnected wire. And one day I will take my teenage plug and connect it to the nearest socket, raping an 85-year-old white woman who is somebody's mother. And as I beat her senseless and set a torch to her bed, a Greek chorus will be singing in 3/4 time. Poor thing. She never hurt a soul. What beasts they are. Thank you.
Oh gosh, Porsha, that was beautiful. Mahogany, that was Temple. Roxane, Oxygen. I'm delighted to be here to celebrate Audre Lorde's legacy, and this new selected work, and I'm just so grateful to Roxane for making this happen. I'm going to read the beginning of one of my favorite Lorde essays, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. And then I'm going to have a conversation with my good friend, Roxane Gay. Let me read it online. Let me do this. I have come to believe over and over that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal, and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood. That speaking profits me beyond any other effect. I am standing here as a Black lesbian poet, and the meaning of all that waits upon the fact that I am still alive and might not have been. Less than 2 months ago, I was told by 2 doctors, one female and one male, that I would have to have breast surgery. And that there was a 60 to 80% chance that the tumor was malignant. Between that telling and the actual surgery, there was a 3-week period of the agony of an involuntary reorganization of my entire life. The surgery was completed and the growth was benign. But within those 3 weeks, I was forced to look upon myself and my living with a harsh and urgent clarity that has left me still shaken, but much stronger. This is a situation faced by many women, by some of you here today. Some of what I experienced during that time has helped elucidate for me much of what I feel concerning the transformation of silence into language and action. In becoming forcibly and essentially aware of my mortality and of what I wished and wanted for my life, however short it may be, priorities and omissions became strongly etched in a merciless light. And what I most regretted were my silences. Of what had I been afraid? To question or to speak as I believed could have meant pain or death. But we all hurt in so many different ways, all the time. And pain will either change or end. Death, on the other hand, is the final silence. And that might be coming quickly now, without regard for whether I had ever spoken what needed to be said or had only betrayed myself into small silences while I planned someday to speak or waited for someone else's words. And I began to recognize a source of power within myself that comes from the knowledge that while it is most desirable not to be afraid, learning to put fear into perspective gave me great strength. I was going to die, if not sooner than later, whether or not I had ever spoken myself. My silences had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you. But for every real word spoken, for every attempt I had ever made to speak those truths for which I am still seeking, I had made contact with other women while we examined the words to fit a world in which we all believed, bridging our differences. And it was the concern and caring of those women which gave me strength and enabled me to scrutinize the essentials of my living. The women who sustained me through that period were Black and white, old and young, lesbian, bisexual, heterosexual, and we all shared a war against the tyrannies of silence. They all gave me a strength and concern without which I could not have survived intact. Within those weeks of acute fear came the knowledge. Within the war, we are all waging with the forces of death, subtle and otherwise, conscious or not. I am not only a casualty, I am also a warrior. What are the words you do not yet have? What do you need to say? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own until you will sicken and die of them, still in silence? Perhaps, for some of you here today, I am the face of one of your fears. Because I am a woman, because I am Black, because I am lesbian, because I am myself, a Black woman warrior poet doing my work. Come to ask you, are you doing yours? Whew. And with that, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome back Roxane Gay.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's such an honor to be here with you, Mahogany, Porsha. Really just, it's an honor to share the stage, and especially in service of Audre Lorde's work.
Right. And again, thank you so much. I mean, I was going to say, you never know what kind of America the book you're working on is going to greet, but in fact you do.
I think for Black people, unfortunately, we generally have a reasonably good sense of the America that we're writing toward, which is actually a real shame and a disgrace when you really think about it.
Yeah.
But here we are.
Here we are.
America.
Here we are in this America. Well, let's start here to that point. And you nodded to this in your introduction. I think two writers for me, and they happen to be both Black queer writers that have this quality are James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. This sense that, like, the speech I just read, she wrote in 1977. And it could very easily have been written a week ago by a Black woman bus driver here in Columbus, Ohio. So what is it about the nature of writers like Audre Lorde that their work feels consistently contemporary?
Well, I think there's a certain quality that those writers have to be prescient in ways that seem supernatural. They just understand the human condition. They understand oppression. They understand humanity and desire. And they are able to also adequately capture it with words.
Right.
And not everyone can do that. And not every good writer can do that. And that's what makes them exceptional and timeless. They just do it in a way that no one else can. Like, you're reading something that's 33 years old.
Right.
Or 43 years old, actually. And it holds up. And that is something I aspire to as a writer and thinker. And it's also an ambition I don't know that I'll ever realize, and that's okay. But, I just think they have this specific ability to see. And not only that, more importantly, they have the ability to say what they see and to do so unapologetically. Like, they're not afraid to hurt your feelings.
Right.
To make you face uncomfortable truths.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a lot of writers, especially today, probably because of social media and the ways that people are unwilling to give anyone the benefit of the doubt, I think that a lot of us write into a culture of fear and are not as willing to make readers uncomfortable because we know that we'll pay a price that we may not be able to pay. So,
right.
I really, yeah.
Whew. I mean, I think to that point, and Mahogany and Porsha, everything everyone read just felt perfect. But there was some talk about possibly reading part of Lorde's letter to Mary Daly, and Mahogany was just like, you can't excerpt it, like it's so important. But I do think let's talk about that a bit, because I think it stands as a striking example of what you're saying. Her literally transforming silence into language and action, but also, she doesn't pull punches, and I wonder what that kind of exchange would look like in 2020.
I think that we're kind of seeing that exchange right now in 2020 with, oh my God, I lost my train of thought. Mary Daly. Yes, we're seeing that exchange happen right now in 2020 because we're celebrating the the centennial of women's suffrage, but it's really white women's suffrage.
Right.
And a lot of Black feminists, myself included, have had to really rain on everyone's parade and say, oh, well, I mean, I'm happy that you're having these celebrations, but you really should be having this in 2065. And I think that they did that. Audre Lorde did that to Mary Daly, to just say, like, I understand that you want this more radical feminism, but we are still trying to catch up. Right. We are still trying to make sure that Black women can breathe. And when she wrote Mary Daly, we were talking about this before the show started, she actually wrote Mary Daly privately and was willing to give her the benefit of the doubt and give her a chance to rethink and respond. And Mary Daly did not respond, which, how dare you?
Could you imagine? I mean, and here we are.
I think that I'm not going to answer Audre Lorde. Like, you got bigger balls than me, I guess, because but also Black people were raised right, so we wouldn't even try it. And so then she took the letter public when she did not get a response. And that was pretty brave because she could have definitely been ostracizing herself against someone who was so powerful. And she did it anyway. She did what had to be done. Right. And I just really appreciate that she wasn't going to let Mary Daly leave anyone behind. Because Black women have been left behind enough.
Right. Yeah. And something else, I mean, that I think is so extraordinary about Audre Lorde's writing, and I appreciate you draw attention to her craft in your beautiful introduction, is that, she uses her subject position and also like the moment. So, whether it's the situation with Mary Daly or being invited, like being the only Black woman invited to a conference. Yes. And that situation is what gives us the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. Has that approach of hers inspired your approach to your kind of the way you use your subject position?
Absolutely. It undergirds everything I do because, here we are again in 2020. And I can go to an event and be the only Black person, or oftentimes, the only person of color. And it's exhausting. And I hate being that person who has to call it out because it's like, man, I just want to sit here and talk about Bravo reality shows. But if you're going to make me your token, you're going to hear about it. And that she was willing to do that. it just, every time I think about, oh, I just don't have the energy to fight this fight, I just realize, no, she had the energy, and she was a mother, and
Mm-hmm.
she was doing all this work, and
Mm-hmm.
then she was dealing with cancer, and so
Right.
I can do it. So it absolutely informs me. It just gives me a little extra courage. And if not courage, then at least just a willingness to do whatever has to be done to bring attention to the issues that we should be talking about.
Absolutely. And I'm grateful for it from her and from you. Well, let's talk about, I mean, you know, I love that you are such a prolific writer, of course, but you're also increasingly a prolific editor. And I appreciate the choices you make, whether it is bringing together people, you know, for an anthology about sexual assault, or in this case, the selected works of Audre Lorde. What is it like, though, faced with Audre Lorde's legacy, to and not just her prose, but her poetry? What's the process like of taking that project on and realizing it?
It was overwhelming. The Audre Lorde estate approached me a couple years ago and asked if I would edit this collection. And my very first thought was, me? Really? Okay. Are you sure you asked the right person? And that's not like humble bragging. It's not like self-negging. I genuinely did not feel up to the task because she is such a staggering talent. And so I actually took more than a year. Oh, okay, sorry. I took more than a year to read in her entire body of work.
Wow.
And decide what to include. And I knew I couldn't include everything. So I wanted to be able to give someone who was not familiar with her work a broad sense of what she did, like in the range. You know how we always talk about who he has the range or she doesn't.
And she does indeed have it.
Lord has the range. And so I wanted anyone who picked up this book to think she has the range. I wanted someone who was unfamiliar with her work to read the book and have a sense of her career and what she accomplished. And I wanted someone who was familiar with her work, even well-read in her work, to read this and, again, just be able to marvel and say, oh, I forgot about that. And just really feel something about her body of work. And then I just started making decisions. And the reality is that I was choosing, 300 pages of work that was all excellent, 370 pages. It was challenging, but also I was going to win no matter what.
Right. It's like, which diamond? Do we want that diamond? Do we want that diamond?
It was an embarrassment of riches. And so I just tried to make the best decisions I could.
That's really wonderful. Now, I do want to remind the some 400 people watching us via 90 Second Why that in a little bit we will have time for questions, so you can submit them and we'll make time for that. But as you are spending a year with all of, I mean, I just think that just like a dream, but that's so cool to be like, oh, here is, the estate of Audre Lorde, like here's the access to all of her papers. Can you give just one example or a couple of discoveries, that even if they didn't necessarily, make it into the final book that you had while, engaging her work?
For me, a lot of her poetry was a discovery. I had read a lot of her earlier work, and I had not read a lot of her later work. And so for me, the discoveries were that she was still producing amazing work in the 90s, and she was still unafraid to say difficult things, to talk about desire. But the biggest surprise wasn't even a single work. For me, the biggest surprise was the reminder that she really talked about sexuality openly. A lot of times in mainstream culture, when people talk about queerness, it's very like Will and Grace. You never really see anyone have sex.
Right.
And she talked about sex. She talked about making love to her partners. She talked about enjoying pleasure and craving it and almost being greedy for it. And that was a surprise because when we think of our intellectual leaders, we don't tend to think of them as sexual beings.
Right.
And so to think of her as a sexual being and to see just how erotic her work was incredibly fun. And my favorite piece, the one piece I knew from the beginning that I was going to include was the uses of the erotic.
Yes. Of course.
Yep. And so really everything else was gravy. But that thing, I just knew. I was like, look. And I also was like, I'm going to put some sexy ass poems in here. Deal with it.
There are some very sexy. And I mean, I at the beginning of this conversation opened with kind of comparing her to Baldwin in some ways. And I do think that there were a lot of rich parallels there. But, Baldwin himself, of course, writing about his own desire relationships. At best, it's coded. And it's certainly never and he was certainly never going to write like an essay like The Uses of the Erotic, which literally just is like, here's my intentionality. Wow. Well, so what do you mentioned that you've had, almost a 3-decade-long relationship with Audre Lorde and her work. What do you remember the beginning? Was there a specific piece or book?
I don't remember the very beginning. I think the very beginning was Zammy.
Okay. Yeah.
And I just remember thinking, what's a mytho? What? And
right? Is this a mytho biography?
Really was like, you know what? All of these existing genres do not accommodate what I'm trying to accomplish here. So I am going to invent my own genre and you're going to deal with it. And I think that was the first thing of hers I read. And then I went from there and read many of her essays over the years, and partly in graduate school and partly on my own. And yes, it started with Zammy.
I love it. I'm very fortunate that my junior year of high school, I had an AP English teacher who she never said it explicitly, but our poetry unit was all poetry by
Hey.
Ooh, all right, girl. We got too hot.
That's how it goes.
That's what
In this brave new world, the internet is not ready for this. The internet is not
It's not. But so my junior year, AP English, my teacher did a poetry unit. And she didn't say it was about feminism. She wasn't like, this is women's studies, but every poem and poet she used was a woman, and was writing about gender. And then at the very end of the unit, we had to, write about a poet we hadn't discussed. And it was just like, okay, wait until you turn it over, and then you have like an hour to write an essay. And it was a poem, Generation, by a poet I never heard of named Audre Lorde. And honestly, I saw the name Audre and I assumed it was a white woman. And so I just sat there staring at this poem for like 5 minutes because I was like, what is this lady Audre putting down? I was so shook. And that was the beginning of the relationship. Well, what is, before we start to get to audience questions, there are so many diamonds that we can pull from Audre's work. And I think because she's so deeply rooted in intersectionality, like we should never really feel that we have to choose. But when you think of whatever we want to call this summer of 2020, is there an aspect of Audre Lorde's work that has kind of been singing, as you're watching the protests and everything that's going on?
Absolutely. One of the main takeaways I think any of us can draw from Audre Lorde's work is that she really believed that differences are strengths, not weaknesses. And when we look at how fractured not only this country, but the world is presently, it's important to remember that we should not be afraid of our differences and we should not shy away from them. I think it's important to embrace them and to recognize the strengths that can rise out of our differences. And she has an essay, I Am Your Sister, Black Women Organizing Across Sexualities, where she was having a conversation with Black women with straight Black women, and just saying, like, we're in this together, we're all Black women, and we're sisters. And so we need to work together, not against each other. And I think that everyone could stand to read that poem and to embrace the spirit of that poem. That essay, and embrace the spirit of it, and this idea that, okay, yes, we're different, and we don't actually need to assimilate to each other and erase our differences in order to work together. And we need to remember that, especially as we are staring down the last 53 days until the election, and we're seeing a lot of people, especially I don't care about conservatives. They're going to do whatever the fuck they're going to do.
Yeah.
They're not
clearly.
Like, they don't care. There's no like bottom to hit. It's just an endless depth of default. But we can reach progressives who are rightly outraged and interested in perhaps voting third party or not voting at all. And I actually really I didn't understand it in 2016. This year, I understand it in that, how do you make people change if you don't do something drastic? At the same time, it's our differences that will unite us, and it's our differences that really make us have to impart to people who are considering holding out. Like, here's what's at stake for people in my skin. Right. And here's what's at stake for people who are working and are making less than minimum wage. And so while you might be fine, no matter who the president is, not everyone is going to be fine. And so, I want us to be able to have that kind of productive conversation and acknowledge, you know what, you're right. We need a president who is 100% down with Medicare for all and universal basic income and everything, term limits, whatever the sort of issues of the day are. I mean, there are so many more than what I've just listed, student loan debt cancellation and so on. But at the same time, before we can get there, we need to get this guy out of office. And this is a country that is very centrist. And so while we need to get more radical, there's no way we're going to go from Donald Trump to socialism. Like, there has to be a way stop on the way there. And so I think
that's interesting because, to the point of her letter to Mary Daly, or the incident that inspires the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house, it's not like, it's interesting. She's always embracing her differences and reminding us to do the same. But also the people she's reaching out to, Mary Daly being an example, are people, obviously there are some clear differences there, right? But she sees the value in building a bridge, right? And so it's not like, like she alludes to like the white fathers, and poetry is not a luxury. Like, she's not like writing an open letter to the white fathers, like, please let me into your like straight white male, like, whatever. Like, I think like Audre Lorde does provide a keen model for like thinking about like, we need to consider who are the people who are not living or politicking like us, but we have a lot to gain from coming together and understanding that.
Absolutely. And you bring up such an important point. Like, she was very interested in building bridges, but she wasn't building bridges in ways that required her to compromise her integrity or give up ground that she was unwilling to cede. Like, she was like, let's build a bridge, and I'm going to come across that bridge on my own terms. And I wish more people realize that you can actually do that. That compromise does not mean surrender and capitulation. It means compromise. Like it means exactly what it is. So yes.
And maybe, as we encourage, ourselves and people we love and people we teach and interact with to engage Audre Lorde's work, like that's a great reason to look at how she's engaging, and it's clear that she is not debating her humanity. She's not she's not like, I'm willing to give up being a queer woman to be accepted in here. You know what I mean? And so I think if you want a model of what it looks like to have that kind of conversation that we all need to have and still maintain your integrity, she does it, masterfully. So here is an audience question. I recently read Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Marie Browne. Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic is foundational to the book. So my question is, how do we center desire and creation in fighting for liberation? That's a beautiful question.
Ooh.
That's a whole book of a question.
That's a great question. And I think one of the most important things is to establish that desire is not frivolous. And it is not something that we do after we do like the hard work of liberation. Like we need to be able to enjoy ourselves so we understand the reasons why we're working toward liberation. Like what are we trying to get to on the other side? Yeah. And I think a lot of that is grounded in desire. And so one of the things I think is most important is for us to destigmatize desire and what the things that we want. And that means doing away with phrases like guilty pleasures and doing away with this idea of thirst. Like whenever someone's like, ooh, he's fine. Like there are like 5 people who are like, oh, you're so thirsty. No, the fuck I'm not.
I'm observant.
Yes, that is a fine person, a man, woman, non-binary person. Like that is a sexy human being. And this idea that you are desperate because you want something, we really have to start to just really dismantle a lot of that thinking and a lot of that language so that we can all just say, you know what, we are people, we are human, we are animals, we want things. And the only thing we should judge is if you take what you want without anyone else's permission, or, like if you are a colonizer, if you will. Like that's the kind of stuff that we have to be against. But using pleasure from a place of power, I think, is so incredibly important. Yeah. And I think that we lose sight of pleasure all too often in activism.
Right. And to her point in the transformation of silence into language of action, if we're constantly swallowing down silences, I would argue that like admitting Seth Rogen is actually quite hot is a pretty easy silence to address. You know what I mean? It's like you could talk about the election, you could talk about capitalism, or you could be like, like Seth Rogen, that laugh kind of.
And I mean, I saw that tweet and look at the conversation you started. Like, thank you. I am late to the church of Seth Rogen. I really came on to like realizing how sexy he is with Launch. And then I went sort of back through, and I just love that he's just like, man, I'm a stoner. I just want to write movies and act in them and like hang out with my wife and kids and just like be fucking sexy as shit. And you just know he's good in bed.
Girl,
he can sit down.
I can't even.
He is. I mean,
handle it. I can't even handle it. And it wasn't before I sat down to interview him. It wasn't something on my radar, but he just. The way he engages people was so charming and thoughtful, and he has a wonderful laugh, and he spoke so adoringly of Beyonce. I was shook. I was like, oh my goodness, it's happening. It's happening now. So I don't see any other questions. This is like last call for questions if you want to get them in.
There were some back up at the top.
Oh, okay.
No. All right. Oh, how does Zami? This is a new.
Oh yeah, I see that.
Yeah, how does Zami as a biomythography decenter the white Eurocentric culture from the core of American literature?
Okay, Anna.
Girl. First,
I mean, it does.
I think that anytime a Black person, a person of color, anyone who's marginalized. I think anytime we write, and we write without compromising like who we are and what we want to say, we don't pander to the white gaze.
Right.
I think that we decenter white Eurocentric culture. But, and I'm not like, Anna, I'm going to say this and I'm not picking on you actually, because I went to grad school and I know like sort of, I think part of it, like what biomythography does is that she didn't play the game where she had to use, I mean, she used plenty of big words, like actually, if you read her work, but she didn't feel the need to only speak in the master's tongue. She was willing to use her own voice and her own language and code switch as needed. And I think that's just so important in decentering white Eurocentric culture, is realizing that, we don't have to toss around these $10 words to say things that are meaningful.
Right. Yeah. And I also think, something that Rachel Katziganza, another, tremendous writer in her own right, says I think about a lot is like, out of the work comes the work. And I think the very nature of Zami, seeing the story of a Black queer woman who comes from like a working class, New York family and is making her way into, librarian studies and making her way through these spaces and is a queer woman and is making space for her relationships and her desires while navigating like these other narrative threads. Where's the other book that's like that at the time? Like, you know what I mean? And so it's like the nature of the work itself, by telling her story, seeing the value. And, now I think the way we think of memoir, and you read, Carmen Maria Machado or, Ocean Vuong, a lot of things that I think we now take for granted in terms of what is invited into the self-portrait, the literary self-portrait, she was doing, and I don't know the conversations that were happening behind the scenes, you know what I mean? But you do see it in terms of her philosophy, and her essays, and I think that's the decentering. Yeah.
So Jasmine asks, thoughts on Audre Lorde and disability work in respects to her vocal experience about breast cancer? That's an interesting question.
It's a beautiful question.
Until Chadwick Boseman died recently, I actually had not thought of cancer in the realm of disability. And because disability is one of those areas I'm still learning and studying in.
Same.
And so when it comes to cancer, Audre Lorde was really vocal. And I actually thought that was incredibly radical, because we have a really specific cultural narrative around cancer, that you are fighting cancer and it's a battle and you're a warrior. And when anyone is like, you know what, I'm fucking unhappy about this disease sucks, the surgery sucks, the chemo sucks, I whenever how someone offers, that level of response to cancer.
Representative John Lewis, I think we saw that a lot. Yeah.
Yes, people get really, perturbed, and they're like, no, but it's your battle. And like, so my mom has cancer right now, and it's not great, but she is very cranky and salty, and she does not want anyone to call her a warrior or a battler. And I really respect that. And so I'm just like, look, however you are feeling today, how you are feeling, and I respect your truth. And just please stop being mean. No.
Please.
But she's being fucking difficult. But it's okay. And so anyway, this is a roundabout way of saying, in terms of disability, I think that it's not for people who have not lived that experience to sort of judge the way that she writes about it. And does it sort of work against a lot of what disability studies is trying to do? Perhaps, but I think that there has to be room in disability studies and disability discourse for people to say things that make us uncomfortable, and to say things that go against the dominant cultural narratives about strength and imperviousness, We see this also in fat studies and when people try to write about fat positivity, but also say, you know what, I'm having a really bad day with my self-esteem today. And a lot of times people are resistant to hearing that. And I get why, because there is so much at stake and you're just trying to be seen as human. And so when you sort of say things that reinforce a lot of the negativity and the stigma around who you are, people are going to not want to hear that. But I actually applaud Audre Lorde for writing her cancer journals and being so open about her experience with cancer.
Right.
It's terrifying. And
it is terrifying.
Doesn't it? I feel like it demystified a lot of, I mean, cancer, I think, is a very individual experience, but in some ways it demystified, like, oh, really, it is as terrible as I think it is. Okay. Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah. I mean, and in terms of, and I'll get to like maybe one more question. Also, I again, and she nods to this in with the breast surgery in Silence. A Black woman writer of her caliber writing about navigating American healthcare, like a lot of the things that, you know, are now very much ongoing conversations in terms of disparities in treatment and, you know, all of that because of race. You know, she was doing it in different ways, and it was impressive. Nicole, wait, I saw it and I had it. I'm sorry. The questions like are quite weirdly fleeting. Oh, someone asked, oh, here we go. Could you talk about, because you did, you know, spend so much time with her work, how you saw her writing change over time? Was there a different kind of color or quality that starts to emerge in her later work?
That's actually a really good question. All the questions have been great, by the way. One of the things I noticed about her work is up and through the 70s, up until I would say the mid 70s, we saw quite a lot about the embodied experience and erotics. And that work was, I mean, those themes were present also in her later work, but to a lesser extent. And I think a lot of it was indeed cancer. And so it was interesting to see that the formative thing in the evolution of her work wasn't the refining of her voice, even though we do see that. I think it was before cancer and after cancer, before understanding her mortality and frailty, and after understanding her mortality and frailty and the indignities of disease. And so I feel like, and it could just be me, but in her earlier work, there was less of an edge, but it was still sharp, to be clear. But her work got sharper as if she understood that she does not have as much time to waste now in her later work. And so there was also a more efficiency of prose and poetry. I thought her poetry became much tighter and leaner, and not necessarily for the better, but it became tighter and leaner. And I wonder if that is a response to the ways in which her body changed. And then, of course, it's what's interesting is that what I think is her strongest book of poetry was The Black Unicorn in 1978. And that's what included A Litany for Survival and But What Can You Teach My Daughter, Sister Outsider, Never Take Fire from a Woman. And so it was interesting also that even though she was already on this evolutionary journey, she had this apex and then stayed at that level of production and intelligence for the rest of her career. And unfortunately, she died at 57, 58.
Gosh.
Which is very, very young. And as a writer, I feel like my 50s are kind of going to be when I hit my stride.
Right.
So,
she didn't even get to become an elder.
No, like she didn't. And I always wonder, what would she have written in her 60s and 70s? We're not ready for it. So.
Yeah. My goodness. Well, I am, as everyone is, clearly just delighted and grateful that Audre Lorde's estate reached out to you. I think we all know exactly why they reached out to you, because I think if we are to think of a clear standard bearer for intersectionality, for what it means to be a Black queer woman in her body, in her country, in her mind, you bring that forth in a way that I think would make Audre Lorde so proud. So thank you for this conversation. Thank you for editing the selected words of Audre Lorde. I hope everyone, I always tell people, but it's true, buy 2 copies, one for yourself, one for someone you love, because when you really love a book, you're not going to want to go on that journey alone. Roxane, Mahogany, Porsha, thank all of you so much for joining us. What a night!
Absolutely.
Good evening. Oh
Please buy the book. Everyone who's like, what can I do? Where do I start? Literally start with the book. That's right there. But please also buy the books of Mahogany Browne, Saeed Jones, and Porsha Olayiwola. I hope I said your last name correctly, Porsha, because these are all incredible writers with incredible work out in the world. And I think many of us are indeed working in the tradition of Audre Lorde. So go and see exactly how.
Be well, everyone. Thank you, Roxane.
Thank you, Saeed.
Bye.